Welcome to the Compaction Technologies service videos. Today we'll be replacing a main actuator. It's December 2020. To start with, you'll need the machine in a space where you can get power to it or an extension cord to make sure that you can power the machine where you're working on it. On the back of the machine there generally is a tool, the black handle, silver shaft with a triangle end. We're going to use this to open the door. There's a hole in the side here. To get started, let's open the main door to take the top off. Insert the triangle key in the side, rotate it a quarter turn towards the front or until you feel resistance. Then the door should be open. The tools you'll need for this job should be included a triangle key and a Wago tool. If you don't have either of those two, an 1/8 inch Allen wrench and a jeweler's screwdriver of the slotted variety will help. These should come in the package of tools or parts that you receive from the store, from Compaction Technologies. You'll also need a 5/32 T-handle or ball end Allen wrench, a slotted screwdriver, a 3/4 deep well socket and box end wrench, and a 3/8 nut driver or ratchet to remove the top. I also like to use work gloves because you're working in a garbage compactor. The parts you should receive from Compaction Technologies will be a main actuator with the reed switch block attached, the reed switch sensor magnet that attaches to the actuator shaft, and the spacer block, which should come zip tied on the end of the actuator like that. Once you've got the bolts loose in the front, the top slides back about 6 inches and you can just lift it off to remove it. You'll notice there's a plate on the back with 2 bolts in it. These bolts do not need to be loosened and the plate does not need to be taken off because it's captured in the back by this bracket. Once you've had the top lifted off, set it off to the side to continue the work. You'll notice on the left-hand side of the machine there is an electronics tray with the circuit board. We're going to be working with the first 3 switches on the outside. Here, here, and here. These are the reed switches and the location of the actuator when it's moving. And this plug, currently it has a red and yellow wire that is the main actuator plug. I'm going to go ahead and unplug all 3 of these. You'll notice on the circuit board it's labeled full, home, and extend. This will be important later when we're wiring the new actuator back in. I'm going to grab my Wago tool, remove the wires from the main actuator's Wago plug. This can also be done with the jeweler's screwdriver by pressing down on the metal in these 2 slots. Once you've removed the wires from the Wago, we're going to use them to jump the actuator down off the screws on the power supply. You'll notice the 120 from the wall in the 3 bottom screws. Above that is a V plus and a V minus of the next 6 screws. Those are 24 volt output. It's important that we use those to jump the actuator down. Red to positive and yellow to negative to extend. I'm simply going to move the actuator very near the bottom. And that should be plenty enough to get the next process started. Let's remove all these wires from the electronics tray through the grommet here so that we can replace this without it getting hung up as we work along. After removing the wires from the grommet, I'm going to remove the rear bolt first, holding the actuator in. I'm going to do this with my 3/4 box end wrench and my ratchet with my 3/4 deep well socket. Once the nut is removed, we'll set it someplace safe so we can replace it later. It's important when you take this bolt out to relieve the pressure from the weight of the actuator and the head because it all hangs at this point from the bolt. So I'm just going to lift up slightly while applying pressure to the bolt to slide it out. You'll notice that the actuator is free and the head hangs all the way down in the down position. The bolt doesn't need to come all the way out, just enough to clear so that the actuator will be loose. Next, we're going to remove the upper bolt on the back side of the actuator. Once I've pulled the back bolt free and the actuator is hanging, I'm going to start by removing the nut in the front. I'm going to remove the nut. And before I pull the bolt out, I want to mention that it's important to remove the back bolt first so that there's no pressure on this front bolt. Next, I'm going to carry the weight of the actuator again so that I can pull this bolt free without the actuator falling. This is why it's important for the wires to be pulled out first, because now I'm going to lower the actuator down and out. You'll notice that it comes with a pivot block. The bolt goes through this and the new main actuator when we put it back in, which you'll see in a moment. Next, gather all the new parts that you were sent and get the main actuator with the reed switch block attached. We'll be installing this now. Go ahead and put the pivot block on the back of the actuator so that the holes line up. Then you're going to slide it into the machine between the two cross members and back into the space where it came from. Now we're going to put the bolt back in. There's a series of things that need to line up: the cross members, the pivot block, the actuator, and the bracket that it mounts in. So it takes a little bit to get all three lined up just right. The bolt should slide easily through, and you can start your nut on the other side and tighten it up. We want the bolt to act like a pin, so don't tighten it down so tight that it doesn't move. Once that's done, we're going to pull all the wires off the left side of the actuator in through the grommet that we took the old wires out of. It's easiest to push the wagos through the grommet first and then the actuator power cord. You'll notice I've left a little slack here for the reed switches. As the actuator moves up and down, this will allow for that movement without putting tension on the wires. Next, I want to extend the main actuator. This can be done two ways. The same way we extended the old one, by touching the power cord to the power supply, or by simply unscrewing the end. You'll notice that the new actuator has a red and a black wire. The red is still positive, and we're still going to press it to the V+ screw heads in order to run it down. Make sure the machine has power or this won't work. Again, we want to double check that the actuator isn't too far out, because it's hard to get the bolt back through it if you extend it too far. Once you've extended the actuator, let's find this piece in the parts box and slide it on the shaft. This is a spacer that we're going to use the sensor guide later. You'll notice that the holes line up on the actuator and on the mechanism to make sure the bolt slides through freely. I'm going to lift up on the mechanism, lining up the actuator in the hole it belongs, and push the bolt through. Next, you'll put the nut back on it and tighten it down. Again, we want the bolt to act like a pin, not like a bolt, so don't over-tighten it. Next, we're going to install the aluminum shaft collar with the sensor magnet on it onto the shaft of the actuator. It butts up against that plastic spacer that we just put in. It's easiest to do this while the actuator is fully extended. This is where your T-handle and your ball and Allen wrench come into play. One thing to note as you're tightening it, you'll want to make sure the magnet lines up in the track that's on the sensor block with the reed switches in it. Once you've got the aluminum shaft collar tightened down, we're going to move to the electronics tray to wire in the new reed switches. You'll notice on the circuit board, you can see that it's printed full prox, home prox, and extend prox. You'll notice on the new wagos for the reed switch, each one is labeled with an E, an H, or an F. These match up with the extend, the full, and the home spots on the circuit board where it's printed. I'm going to go ahead and plug them into their proper location. Once you have the reed switches plugged into their location, I like to take the wires and tuck them down underneath the corner of the circuit board and put any of the remaining wire in the back of the electronics bay. The next step is to attach the wago back onto the power wires for the main actuator. We want to make sure that the red is toward the front of the machine or the right of the clip. Again, using a jeweler's screwdriver and pushing down in this slot, or using your wago tool to hold the alligator clip open, we're going to slide the wires in, hold them firmly in place, and pull the wire tool out. It's a good idea to give it a tug to make sure that the clip is holding the wire in place. We'll repeat the same process with the negative wire, and then we'll plug the actuator back in. You'll want to run the excess wire to the back of the circuit board in the electronics tray and plug the wago in where we unplugged it to start. At this point, it's a good idea to reprogram the circuit board and make sure that it's only running 9 amps on the actuator during descent. You'll want it to say program mode. With the big door open, it should say program mode on the circuit board. We're going to press the scroll select button for about 10 seconds and it will change to edit mode. Once it says edit mode, release the scroll select button and press it again. You'll notice that it'll start giving you options: trash door openings, compactor max amperage. This is the one we want to adjust. By pressing the decrease button, we're going to change it from 12 down to 9.00. Then we're going to press the scroll select button again until we find the option that says save and exit. Save and exit. I'm going to press the increase button to change it to yes, and then press scroll select again to save and exit. It will say settings saved, and then it will go back to program mode. Once the reprogramming is done on the circuit board, we're going to go ahead and close the main door and let the actuator retract to the home position. Because I use the triangle key to open the door, I have to use the triangle key to close the door. Again in the side, quarter turn towards the back until you feel resistance. You'll notice that the actuator immediately starts running down and then back up. Once it's stopped, it should say ready on the front of the machine, and the actuator should be in what we call the home position, and we're going to measure to make sure the height is correct. With a tape measure, measuring from the upside down 1/4 inch J piece of steel with the bumper on it, we're going to measure to the bracket that the top slides into. We're looking for 6 3/4 to 7 inches. It looks like this is 7 1/2 or 7 1/4, so we're a little low. We'll have to make an adjustment, and in order to do that, we're going to loosen the reed switch block on the actuator and slide it down ever so slightly. It's easiest to do this with the door open so that none of the functions of the actuator work. Using your slotted screwdriver, we'll back off both of these hose clamps. One you can really get loose. The other one I suggest leaving fairly tight, as you want to make sure that the reed switch block does not go sliding all over the place. As far as the reed switch sensitivity is concerned, every 1/8 inch of movement of this block equals a full inch of stroke on the back corner. So we want to move it down very slightly to get that 1/4 inch. I'm going to tighten my first hose clamp back up again to hold it in place while it runs a compaction cycle, leaving the back one loose in case we need to adjust it again. The easiest way to make it run a compaction cycle is by waving your hand under the motion sensitive door 3 times to open and close. Three, 2. After you've adjusted the reed switches, measure again to make sure you've got it where you want it to be. It looks to be right at 6 3/4, which is perfect. 2 things to note while you're adjusting the reed switch block is to make sure when you're done, you tighten both hose clamps so that the reed switch block doesn't move, and that the reed switch block stays centered over the top of the actuator to make sure that the magnet moves up and down in the channel properly. After everything else is assembled, feel free to clean up the reed switch wires with zip ties and double check to make sure everything is tight, including the aluminum block that holds the magnet over the reed switch block, and again, tightening down the hose clamps so that the reed switch block doesn't get out of alignment. After you've got everything settled and you feel comfortable with the actuator installation, it's important to test it a few times before you put the top back on, just in case anything else needs to be adjusted. Again, you can wave your hand under the door 3 times to make it run a compaction cycle, or you can do a quick key using the machine key on the side, simply turning it to the open position and back to the closed position quickly. An important safety note is, when you're working on the equipment and the top is off, that all the moving parts are accessible. And you need to make sure that if you're going to run the actuator, your hands are clear of it, and all your tools as well. The last thing to do is to put the top back on and report to the manager that the work is done. If you have any questions at any point throughout the process, please call us at 612-230-2209, or on the inside of the machine, there's an 800 number that you can see right here on the serial tag that will also reach the service department. We hope you found this video helpful, and we look forward to working with you in the future.